Hello friends and welcome to the EPG Pathshala. I am Nilofer Bharucha, adjunct faculty in the Department of English and the director and scientist in charge of the COHAB IDC, the Constructions of Home and Belonging and Indian Diaspora Center at the University of Mumbai. Today I am going to talk to you about the emergence and development of diaspora studies. This is a module which has been written for you by Johann Salazar. Diaspora has become an important aspect of academic studies today, and it has been offered as modules or as independent courses by universities in India and around the world. However, it is important to know the beginnings of this academic study, to know how this branch of study emerged, what are the theoretical concepts behind this branch of study. So this is what the talk today is going to help you to understand. Let us start with the word diaspora itself. It has its origin in the ancient Greek word spairo, meaning to sow or to disperse. While the earliest occurrence of the word diaspora has been traced to its use by Sophocles, Herodotus and Thucydides in the 5th century BC, its more modern interpretation is more closely linked to its use in the Jewish tradition. Today, the word diaspora has a much wider application. It is used to describe a number of groups, situations and processes that are implicated in cross-border migrations. While the term diaspora has a long history, its use in the social sciences is more recent. One of the earliest appearances, Dufa points out, is in 1931 in the America Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, where a historian named Simon Dubnoff, who authored the entry on diaspora, tried to demonstrate that its use could go beyond the religious meaning. However, despite attempts by scholars to take forward this broadened definition, it continued to have a largely religious meaning up till the 1950s. One possible explanation for this is that prior to the 1960s, migrants were expected to give up their old identity and assimilate into the culture of their new home. The notion of diaspora caught between two cultures is recent. By the 1960s, newspapers and dictionaries began to accept a wider usage of the term. Despite this, it was a long time before the term entered the social science vocabulary. We can think about 4 phases in the development of diaspora studies. It is only in the 1960s and 70s that we see the emergence of diaspora studies with an exponential growth in the interest in the concept. This interest can be seen from the rise in the incidence of diaspora as a keyword, from only once or twice a year use in dissertations to about 13 times a year in the late 1980s and nearly 130 times a year in 2001 alone. This is from information given to us by Brubaker. Robin Cohen tries to draw out a chronology of diaspora studies by identifying 4 phases that the discipline has passed through. In the first phase, the concept of diaspora is strongly tied to the Jewish prototype, and scholars are focused on studying groups that closely resemble this model. The second stage represents a move away from a definition of diaspora linked with victimhood to include a number of groups that lived outside of their country of origin and had an engagement with their homeland. The third stage sees a further broadening of the definition that resulted from scholars questioning these concepts, which were used to frame the broader concept of diaspora. Realizing that the concept may lose its potential as an analytical category, the fourth stage makes an attempt to reclaim it. We shall look at each of these stages in more detail. The prototypical diaspora. In the first phase that Cohen calls the prototypical diaspora, a phase which comprises the 1960s to the 1970s, the term diaspora still carries the weight of its religious meaning and is limited to describing certain dispersed groups, particularly the Jews, Greeks and Armenians, who are considered to be the classic diasporas. Gradually, others like the Africans and Irish also began to be studied under the ambit of the concept of diaspora. These groups whose displacement is characterized by a moment or period of trauma that caused their initial dispersion from their homeland was the focus of diaspora studies in this first phase. Cohen calls these victim diasporas, which are categorized by two important features. The first, traumatic exit from the homeland, and second, the centrality of the homeland for the group. Now we come to broadening the scope of the diaspora. This is the second phase. This extends from the 1980s to mid-1990s and witnessed a broadening of the scope of diaspora studies. As scholars began to realize there were a number of groups besides the prototypical victim diasporas that were encountering similar situations, either being compelled to leave or voluntarily leaving their homelands or not being accepted in the places they had settled in. This concept of the diaspora thus expanded to include different categories of people like expatriates, expellees, political refugees, alien residents, immigrants, and ethnic and racial minorities. According to Dufa, until the mid-1980s, the term diaspora was used in two distinct ways. First, to refer to certain groups living outside of a reference territory, and second, to refer specifically to African trading networks. However, he notes that this was without any real effort to define diaspora. At this point, two important publications that got people talking about diaspora were Modern Diasporas in International Politics by Gabriel Scheffer, published in 1986, and The Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy in 1993. But the setting up of the international journal Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies by Kachek Tolayan in 1991, marked the coming of age of the concept of diaspora and diaspora studies, as it served as a clarion call to scholars to think about and discuss diaspora and help to propel the discussion forward. In the very first issue of the journal Diaspora, William Safran presents his definition, which is among the earliest and most influential definitions of the term and concepts of diaspora. Rather than have a one-fit-all definition for the many different diasporas, he crafts an ideal type of diaspora from a set of 6 characteristics. These may be summarized as follows. 1. Dispersion from a single center of origin to 2 or more foreign peripheries. 2. Retention of a collective memory of the homeland. 3. Yet feeling a degree of alienation from it. 4. Hope of eventual return for them or their descendants. 5. Belief that the homeland should be supported. 6. Maintenance of a relationship with the homeland. This allowed for a broader definition of diaspora. Scholars now found themselves looking at many different groups under the term diaspora, some of whom had adopted the term themselves and others to whom the term was applied. These include groups such as Cubans and Mexicans in the USA, Pakistanis in Britain, Maghrebis in France, Turks in Germany, Poles, Blacks in North America, Corsicans in Marseille, Ukrainians, Italians, Russians, Germans, Tamils, Sikhs, Hindus, so on and so forth. In short, people living outside of their homeland. In the first 7 years since it began, from 1991 to 1998, the journal Diaspora had recorded some 36 communities that were identified as diasporas, either by themselves or by scholars studying them. There were efforts to classify these groups into types and subtypes and extrapolate lists of characteristics by which to mark out the limits of the concept. Homeland became an important focal point, not only as a place of origin, but also in terms of ethnicity, history, cultural memory, continued engagement, and hope of return. Cohen has also argued for a recognition of the positive sides of diaspora, who in spite of, or perhaps because of their anxiety over their situation, are driven to succeed, and towards this encourage co-ethnic solidarity. From the mid-1990s, the term diaspora began to find more frequent and varied usage. As the editor of the journal Diaspora, Kachek Tolayan collected and published a number of odd and sometimes interestingly nuanced and at other times outrageously inappropriate uses under the heading diasporama, corporate diaspora, egg cream diaspora, anatomical diaspora, and these are just some examples that seem to stray furthest from the conventional meaning. This feeling was echoed by other academics studying diaspora such as James Clifford, who noted that, I quote, "For better or worse, diaspora discourse is being widely appropriated," unquote. The growing popularity of the concept caused it to expand to a point where it became a buzzword, even among academics, that began to stretch the concept far beyond its earlier meanings. This was made possible by the criticism, particularly from social constructionists, who pointed out that scholars had hitherto privileged the etic over the emic in diaspora research, and that diaspora was centered around essentialist notions about homeland and ethnic religious community. The works of Stuart Hall, James Clifford, and Paul Gilroy have been a key in setting the foundation for this perspective by shifting the focus from point of departure and maintenance of an identity to paradoxical identity, the non-center, and hybridity, as quoted in Dufa 2008. The focus on ethnic religious community that was one of the preoccupations of diaspora studies came under critique. It was suggested that the study of diasporic groups should go beyond the ethnic and religious communities and should also be concerned with their constituent parts such as race, class, caste, gender, etc. The homeland that was hitherto the cornerstone to the concept of diaspora came under criticism from social constructionists such as Cohen. The idea of the home was no longer an actual space. For scholars like Autar Bra, home was more about a desire to belong, and the homeland, which is a place in the diasporic imagination that cannot be visited or returned to. An important usage of diaspora in this regard is its use to refer to queer or gay diasporas. As Toloyan explains in an interview with Robin Cohen, those people who identified as gay, lesbian, queer might be forced to immigrate to escape harsh social conditions and law, and when this is not possible, they are forced to go underground. It therefore becomes possible now to talk about diaspora without migration, since this is also a kind of displacement, and the people so displaced can also be considered the diaspora. In his article titled The Diaspora, Rogers Bakers in 2005 points out that the concept of diaspora has been dispersed and that the broadening of the concept to include more and more groups runs the risk of rendering the concept useless as an analytical tool. He says, if everyone is diasporic, then no one is distinctively so. The sentiment is reflected by others such as Robin Cohen and Lily Cho, who see this watering down of the concept as a threat to its efficacy as a working concept. But with this recognition that diaspora has traveled so extensively and so easily across definitional and disciplinary boundaries that it risks losing any but the broadest and most general of meanings, there is also an effort in the 2000s. This sentiment is reflected by others such as Robin Cohen and Lily Cho, who see this watering down of the concept as a threat to its efficacy as a workable concept. But with this recognition that diaspora has traveled so extensively and so easily across definitional and disciplinary boundaries that it risks losing any but the most general of meanings, there is also an effort in the 21st century to retain meaning in the concept of diaspora by considering the social constructionist critiques and finding a middle ground. Cohen calls this period the consolidation phase. Safran, looking at the notion of homeland, finds that the more rigid understanding of it has given way to softer notions like, I quote, found home. Moreover, as life in the diaspora becomes more secure, both physically and emotionally, there is a need felt for identifying with the homeland elsewhere. Cho's solution is to think of diasporas not as an object of analysis, but rather as a condition of subjectivity. In this way, she draws attention to the conditions that give rise to diasporas, particularly the relationship to power, whether that is power which diasporas are struggling towards or struggling against. Schofield 2006, draws parallel between social movements and the formation of diasporas and uses literature on social movements to gain insights and to understand diasporas. Similarly, Chariandi in 2006 sees in diaspora a subversive tactic by which marginalized communities can challenge their subordinate status. Let us look at some more conceptual explorations. With the broadening of the definition of the concept, there is also a shift from negative associations with the terms such as exile, loss and suffering to more positive connotations such as opportunity and mobility. Or to use an often cited quote by Tolleyan, where once there was displacement, now there is diaspora. Mishra in 2006 has a focus which is more on diaspora criticism. He doesn't attempt a chronological mapping of diaspora studies, but instead identifies three nodes around which scholarship on diaspora has centered. For him, these three nodes were formed out of two shifts in the thinking of diaspora. The first shift moves away from thinking about diaspora with reference to their countries of origin and destination. The second shift moves towards a more specific and contextualized study of diasporas. He calls the resulting nodes scenes of exemplification, namely the scene of dual territory, the scene of situational laterality, and the scene of archival specificity. However, he is quick to point out that these scenes do not constitute neat temporal blocks, rather they intersect across the same temporal axis, and some participants end up contributing to more than one. You can look up the references for these quotations in Mishra 2006. In the scene of dual territory, scholars focus on the split between the homeland and the hostland, treating these as stable entities and seeing diasporic groups as being suspended between the two in a way that they are living without belonging to one and belonging without living in the other, as noted by Mishra again in 2006. Scholars in this scene are involved in broadly three projects. The first is to try to identify a new kind of being that makes up a diaspora, an uprooted ethnic cluster that fluctuates between the homeland and the hostland. The second is to identify, organize and categorize the characteristics of these clusters. And the third, to study the role of memory through the use of social, cultural and aesthetic practices of the cluster in the formation of their identity and their linkages between the homeland and hostland. This premise of a well-bounded homeland and hostland with a diaspora caught in between didn't sit well with some scholars. The upsetting of the premise is what Mishra, again in 2006, sees as creating an epistemic rift. In the second scene, the scene of situational laterality, homogenized, circumscribed and nationalized territories no longer function as privileged reference for identity formation, as noted by Mishra. Instead, diasporic identity is seen as being the result of a process of becoming that is specific to the situation in which it arises. Therefore, in this scene, a territory defined by a geopolitical boundary is not necessary for the formation of identity of diaspora. This makes it possible to account for multi-local diasporas. The third is the scene of archival specificity. It draws on both the previous scenes with one major difference. In this scene, scholars are no longer interested in developing general theories of diaspora, but busy themselves with performing what Mishra has called archaeology on specific diasporas. This comes with a recognition that the idealist scenarios presented in the earlier scenes needs to be questioned and critiqued through the study of individual histories of specific diasporas. For Mishra, this recognition marks the second epistemic reef in the diaspora criticism. When looking at the evolution of diaspora studies and the changes that have occurred in the meaning and usage of the term, it is important that we look at the conscious and intentional efforts to avoid its use altogether. While this is much more difficult to trace since the term is being avoided, it is important that we mention this here since it also contributes to the diaspora studies. Let us talk about diasporas and borderlands. One situation where the word diaspora is not considered to be the most apt, even if it is technically correct, is when two countries, the homeland and the hostland, share a common border. When dealing with transnational migrations, diaspora overlaps with the concept of borderland. In these borderlands, where homeland and hostland are geographically contiguous, there is constant going and coming by migrants. Migrations across the border of India and Nepal, or those across Mexico and the USA, are a continuous give and take between communities on either side. Clifford emphasizes that, I quote, borderlands are distinct in that they presuppose a territory defined by a geopolitical lines. Two sides arbitrarily separated and policed, but also joined by legal and illegal practices of crossing and communication, unquote. Diaspora, on the other hand, involves transnational migration that are not centered on any particular geopolitical border and may involve linking of multiple communities across a number of different borders. Diasporic migrations also tend to be over longer distances, with return to the homeland more frequently aspired to rather than actually undertaken. This brings us once again to the concept of the homeland. It is plain to see from the above discussion that the concept of homeland is central to the concept and discourses of the discipline of diaspora studies. This has been recognized by scholars such as Bra in her seminal work 1996, who notes that diaspora embodies a subtext of home. And Tolayan in 2012 writes that in his mapping of diaspora studies, he sees it as one of the three formative binaries, the other two being dispersion diaspora and subjective objective. The homeland has been a persistent defining characteristic of diasporas. However, the understanding of homeland and the relationship that the diaspora has with it has undergone significant change in the evolution of diaspora studies. In earlier approaches to migration, where migrants were expected to assimilate with their host country, there was no conceptualizing of homeland and therefore also no talk of diaspora because it was seen as merely a point of origin. However, scholars began to realize that migration did not sever ties that people had to their countries of origin. This resulted in attempts to understand and theorize these relationships between diasporas and their homelands. As we have seen, Mishra points out that diasporas were once seen as being caught between the homeland and the hostland. Here the homeland was understood as a geographic concept to which diasporas felt a sense of belonging to, coupled with a feeling of exile from and also a shared hope of return. This conception of homeland flows from the Jewish prototype, where there was a hope that they might find themselves next year in Jerusalem. Return to this homeland that exists in geographic space is not only aspired to but also attempted and carried out. The creation of the State of Israel and the return of many Jews is an example of this. However, as the concept of diaspora broadened, this idea of homeland linked to a territory to which the diaspora hopes to return someday began to be questioned on two counts. The first was the idea of return, and second was the link between the idea of a homeland and geographical space. And both of these go hand in hand. Safran, in his 1991 piece, demonstrates that while there are many diasporas that maintain a myth of return to the homeland, not all are interested in actually going home. Clifford 1994 points out that this idea of a homeland linked to a specific geographical space does not hold true in many cases, and that constructions of homeland are more oriented towards maintaining a sense of community than towards a single territory. Further, Hall in 1990 has pointed out that the current age is characterized by hybridity. This means that it is possible for people to comfortably maintain hybrid identities of belonging to their new home and also to the homeland. Another significant contribution in this regard was the idea of a homing desire suggested by Bra, who argues that, I quote, "the concept of diaspora offers a critique of discourse of fixed origins while taking into account a homing desire as distinct from a desire for a homeland," unquote. Thus, we see that the concept of the homeland has undergone much change in the history of diaspora studies. Moreover, the experiences of different diasporic groups and individuals with regard to their relationship with the homeland have been very different. It is for these reasons that Tolleyan warns that we must be careful not to locate the diasporic's home in the ancestral homeland too easily, unquote. So, friends, we have seen in this talk how the concept of diaspora originated, first with the dispersal of the Jews, and then in the context of the Greeks and some Armenians, which was mainly a religious connotation. Then it was broadened, the concept was broadened to include people during the colonial period who were displaced voluntarily or involuntarily, and this was mainly the labor diaspora. Then in the post-colonial period, we had the professional diaspora. So from being a very narrow concept, the concept of diaspora has now, according to some critics, become overbroad, because it under its nomenclature, under this nomenclature of diaspora, we have so many possibilities. We have exiles, we have refugees, we have the gay diaspora, or what is also called the queer diaspora, where people are not necessarily in a geographical diaspora but are displaced because of their sexual identities. So, diaspora has become a kind of an umbrella word today. That is why one needs to be careful to read whatever is available, whatever literature is available on the diaspora. This particular module has given you so many references, so many quotations from various authors, from various critics. Go through it carefully in order to understand the concept of diaspora.